Go on, ma'am. Why don't you fire up the old Warthog for us? I'm sure it's more your speed. The crowd of young, swaggering aviators in their flight suits chuckled, a wave of condescending amusement rippling through the sterile, blue-lit briefing room of the Advanced Warfighter Simulation Center. The air, usually thick with the electric tension of high-stakes training, was now polluted with the cheap smoke of arrogance. Major Cade Thorne, the source of the insult, stood with his arms crossed, a smug, self-satisfied smirk plastered across his face. He was the gatekeeper of this digital kingdom, a man whose own respectable but unremarkable career as a fighter pilot had soured into a cynical stewardship of the next generation. He saw himself not as a mentor, but as a crucible, one whose job it was to burn away the perceived weakness and unworthiness of others. And today, his gaze had fallen upon the civilian technical advisor, a woman named Evelyn Morgan. The woman they laughed at, a contractor with silver threading her temple and lines of quiet observation etched around her eyes, offered no reaction. Her silence was not timid. It was vast, an ocean of calm that simply absorbed the petty waves of their derision. She simply adjusted the unremarkable gray jacket she wore over a simple button-down shirt and continued her methodical check of the simulator's primary console, her movements economical and serene. She was here to certify the final software patch for the new F-39 Wraith simulator, a machine so advanced it was said to bleed the line between the virtual and the real. Her presence was an anomaly in this room of sculpted jawlines and youthful bravado. She did not wear the wings of an aviator, nor the uniform of a ranking officer. She was in their eyes, an outsider, a relic from a bygone era of analog dials and purely mechanical flight, someone who probably thought a Hoda's was a spicy dish. But when General Marcus Vance, watching from the darkened observation deck above, a silent sentinel overlooking his domain, saw the way her fingers danced over the cold start sequence, not just tapping, but ghosting, anticipating the machine's response with a familiarity that bordered on intimacy. A ghost of a memory flickered in his mind. It wasn't a clear memory, but a feeling, a resonance of something he'd heard whispered in secure video conferences, a call sign spoken only in classified after-action reports, of a pilot who didn't just fly machines, but communed with them. A legend who had faded from active duty into the quiet annals of black projects and developmental programs. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, the casual dismissal in the room below suddenly feeling like a profound and dangerous miscalculation. If you believe true competence needs no introduction, type quiet professional below. Major Thorne, meanwhile, was warming to his theme, emboldened by the sycophantic laughter of the junior pilots who orbited him like eager moons. Seriously, Evelyn, is that your name? Evelyn. We appreciate you coming down to check the wiring, but this machine here, he said, patting the gleaming fuselage of the simulator rig, this is a different animal. This isn't some old A-10 Thunderbolt, a flying tank that you just point at the ground and make burr-arty noises with. This is a fifth-generation, multi-role, network-centric weapons platform. It thinks faster than you can blink. The stress load on the pilot is immense. He was pacing now, a lecturer addressing a room of disciples, using Evelyn as his cautionary example. Her stillness, her utter lack of engagement, seemed to fuel his verbosity. It was a vacuum his ego felt compelled to fill. You see, gentlemen, he continued, gesturing to the rapt audience, the Wraith demands more than just stick and rudder skills. It demands a symbiotic relationship with the machine. It requires a pilot to process 1,000 points of data per second, to manage stealth systems, electronic warfare suites, and sensor fusion, all while pulling 9GS. It's a young person's game. It requires reflexes honed by a lifetime of digital immersion. Not, he trailed off, waving a dismissive hand in her direction. Not a lifetime of filing paperwork for a defense contractor. The insult landed with another ripple of snickers. Evelyn Morgan did not look up. Her focus remained entirely on the diagnostic screen. A green light blinked, then another. Her hands moved from the keyboard to a side panel, her touch light, practiced and certain. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion. It was the pure economy of movement that only comes from 10,000 hours of repetition, a physical manifestation of deep, ingrained competence. Her silence was a fortress. It gave Thorne's insults nothing to cling to, no purchase, and they fell away into the sterile, conditioned air of the simulation bay. To the young pilots, her lack of response looked like meekness, an admission of her irrelevance. To General Vance, watching from above, it looked like something else entirely. The unshakable calm of a professional who had faced pressures far greater than the fragile ego of a mid-level officer. He had seen that same calm in the eyes of Tier 1 operators before a mission, a placidity that wasn't an absence of feeling, but a perfect and total control over it. He watched her posture, the straightness of her spine, the relaxed set of her shoulders. It was the posture of someone completely at home in the cockpit of a high-performance aircraft, even a simulated one. The pieces were beginning to click into place, and a sense of profound unease began to settle over him. Not for the woman, but for the major who was so spectacularly, so publicly, digging his own grave. The stage for this casual humiliation was a temple of modern warfare. The simulation center was the crown jewel of the base, a $100 million facility where the air itself hummed with the silent processing of supercomputers. Cavernous rooms held full-scale cockpit simulators for every aircraft in the fleet, mounted on hydraulic gimbals that could replicate the violent physics of aerial combat with gut-wrenching fidelity. Today's focus was the F-39 Wraith, the newest and most secret weapon in the arsenal. Its simulator was a thing of dark beauty, a sleek black teardrop of composite materials and holographic displays. Inside, a pilot wasn't just flying a program. They were jacked into a digital ghost of the real thing, a perfect one-to-one replication of the most complex fighting machine ever built. The young pilots gathered were the best of the best, the top guns of their generation, selected for the ferociously competitive Wraith program. They were, to a man, brimming with the kind of unshakable confidence that comes from a life of uninterrupted success. They saw Evelyn Morgan not as a person, but as a functionary, an older woman in sensible shoes who was there to ensure their multi-million-dollar toy was working correctly. Her quiet presence was an affront to their world of supersonic speed and carefully cultivated swagger. Major Thorne continued his monologue, his voice echoing slightly in the large chamber. The scenario we're running today is a dead stick landing in adverse weather with multiple system failures. It's a nightmare. Total engine flameout, cascading avionics failures, and a crosswind that would tear the wings off a lesser bird. Lieutenant Jensen here, he said, clapping a young, nervous-looking pilot on the shoulder, is about to find out what real pressure feels like. Jensen offered a tight, uncertain smile. He was barely 25, with the sharp eyes and quick hands of a natural, but the weight of expectation was a physical presence in the room. Evelyn, having completed her diagnostic, finally straightened up. She gave a single, curt nod, a signal that the system was ready. Her eyes, a clear and steady gray, met Thorne's for a fraction of a second. There was no anger in them, no fear, no resentment. There was only a placid, analytical depth, like a calm sea that hides unfathomable power. The look unsettled Thorne for a moment, a flicker of doubt that he quickly extinguished with another blast of arrogance. "All right, Jensen, into the belly of the beast. Show the lady how it's done," he boomed. As Lieutenant Jensen climbed into the cockpit and the canopy hissed shut, sealing him inside the simulated world, Evelyn moved to a secondary monitoring station, a bank of screens that showed every input, every system status, every twitch of the pilot's controls. She stood with her hands clasped loosely behind her back, a picture of detached professionalism. The main screen at the front of the room flickered to life, showing the pilot's view. A churning gray sky, sheets of digital rain lashing against the canopy, and the distant, wavering lights of a runway barely visible through the storm. The simulation had begun. The room fell into a tense silence. The only sounds the hum of the computers and the strained breathing of Lieutenant Jensen over the comms. Thorne stood near the main console, arms crossed, the smug professor watching his student face the impossible test he had designed. He was so focused on the manufactured crisis on the screen, so wrapped up in his own authority, that he failed to notice the true storm gathering in the room. The quiet, patient, and utterly devastating competence of the woman he had so foolishly dismissed. He had made the classic mistake of the arrogant. He had confused a lack of noise with a lack of substance, and he was about to learn, in the most public and humbling way imaginable, that the most dangerous forces in the world are often the most silent. The atmosphere in the briefing room grew thick with tension. On the main screen, the simulated F-39 Wraith was a wounded bird falling from a hostile sky. Alarms blared through the speakers, a chaotic symphony of digital failure. Master caution. Hydraulic pressure dropping. Flight control system failure. Jensen's voice was tight, strained, the carefully cultivated calm of fighter pilot beginning to fray at the edges. He was fighting the controls, his inputs jerky and overcorrected. The runway lights, once a distant promise of safety, were now careening wildly across the screen as the aircraft entered a dangerous oscillation. The young pilots, moments before full of swagger and jokes, were now silent, their faces etched with a dawning horror. They were all imagining themselves in that cockpit, feeling the sickening lurch of a multi-million-dollar machine coming apart around them. This wasn't a game. It was a digital rehearsal for death, and their colleague was failing. Major Thorne's face had hardened, his earlier smugness replaced by a grim scowl. "Control your descent rate, Jensen. You're chasing the needle." Small, precise inputs, he barked in his microphone. But his words were just more noise in an already overloaded system. The young lieutenant was in the grip of panic, his training overwhelmed by the sheer cascade of failures. The Wraith simulator, bucking on its hydraulic legs, pitched violently. A collective gasp went through the room. I can't hold it. It's not responding." Jensen cried out, his voice cracking. On the screen, the ground rushed up to meet them. The simulation was seconds from a catastrophic, ground-splattering conclusion. It was in that moment of absolute crisis, when all hope seemed lost, that Evelyn Morgan moved. She didn't run or shout. She took two calm, deliberate steps to the instructor's override console, the one Thorne had been grandstanding from just moments before. Her hand moved with a blur of practice speed, flicking a single, guarded switch. "I have control," she said. Her voice, the first substantive word she had spoken all day, cut through the panic like a surgeon's scalpel. It was calm, level, and held an unmistakable note of absolute authority. She didn't ask for permission. She stated a fact. The effect was instantaneous. Major Thorne, who had been about to shout another useless instruction, froze, his mouth half open. The room's attention snapped from the failing pilot on the screen to the quiet woman at the console. Her fingers flew across the controls, not with the frantic energy of Jensen, but with the fluid, effortless grace of a master concert pianist. Her eyes were locked on the telemetry data streaming across a secondary monitor, her mind processing the torrent of information that had broken the younger pilot. She was not just seeing the data, she was reading it, understanding the language of the dying machine. She was communing with the ghost in the simulation. Her hands moved in a symphony of precision. One hand danced on a small joystick, making minute, almost imperceptible adjustments to the flight controls. The other flew across a touchscreen, rerouting power from non-essential systems, bypassing damaged circuits, and manually deploying backup control surfaces. It was a feat of technical virtuosity that was simply breathtaking to witness. The violent bucking of the simulated aircraft ceased. The wild oscillation smoothed out. The nose of the F-39, which had been plummeting towards the Earth, slowly, miraculously, began to level out. She had stabilized a machine that the simulation's own parameters had defined as uncontrollable. The room was utterly, completely silent. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic tapping of her fingers on the console and the simulated sound of wind screaming over the wings of the now gliding aircraft. The young pilots stared, their mouths agape, their earlier arrogance replaced by a profound and humbling awe. They were watching something that shouldn't be possible. They were witnessing a level of airmanship that they had only ever read about in textbooks, a legendary calm under pressure that existed in a realm far beyond their own experience. They were watching a master at work. Major Thorne stood as if turned to stone, his face a mask of disbelief. Every confident assertion he had made, every condescending remark, every piece of arrogant advice was being systematically dismantled by the quiet, undeniable competence of the woman he had ridiculed. He had dismissed her as a relic, a paper pusher from a bygone era. But the relic was now flying his state-of-the-art machine with a skill and precision that bordered on supernatural. His entire worldview, built on a foundation of superficial judgment and ego, was cracking beneath his feet. He wasn't just being proven wrong. He was being shown that he didn't even understand the question. The impossible had become possible, and the silence in the room was deafening. On the main screen, the digital storm still raged, but the F-39 Wraith was no longer a falling rock. It was a glider, a wounded but defiant eagle being guided to Earth by a firm and knowing hand. Evelyn Morgan hadn't just saved the aircraft from a crash. She had tamed it. She had imposed her will upon the chaos, not through brute force, but through a deep, intuitive understanding of the machine's limits and capabilities. She was flying the simulation on a razor's edge, balancing airspeed, descent rate, and control surface authority in a delicate life-or-death equation. The runway, once a chaotic blur, was now perfectly centered in the heads-up display. But there was a new problem. Gear is unresponsive. The primary and secondary hydraulics are gone, she stated, her voice as level as the horizon she was creating. We're landing dead stick, no gear. A fresh wave of shock passed through the onlookers. A belly landing, in a storm, with no power, in a stealth fighter with notoriously tricky low-speed handling characteristics. It was a maneuver so dangerous, so fraught with peril, that it was considered a near-impossible contingency, something you briefed but never expected to execute. For Jensen, it would have been a death sentence. For Evelyn Morgan, it was merely the next logical step in a complex problem. Her hands never stopped moving. Her eyes never left the screens. She was coaxing the aircraft, whispering to it through the controls, bleeding off speed with surgical precision. She held the nose up, using the entire fuselage as an airfoil to maintain lift until the last possible second. The young pilots watched, utterly mesmerized. They were seeing their entire education, their entire conception of what was possible in an airplane being rewritten in real time. They had been taught the procedures, the checklists, the emergency responses. But what they were witnessing now was beyond procedure. It was art. It was the fusion of human and machine, a seamless expression of will and engineering that transcended the written rules. It was the kind of flying that created legends. 500 feet, she said, almost to herself. 400, the simulated ground crew audio crackled to life, a voice filled with programmed panic. Maverick, your gear is not down. Repeat, your gear is not down. Wave off. Wave off. Evelyn ignored it. She was in a state of pure flow, a zone of concentration so absolute that the outside world had ceased to exist. There was only her, the machine, and the runway. 100 feet. 50-inch with a final delicate input. She flared the aircraft, raising the nose just enough to scrub off the last remnants of airspeed. The rear of the simulated F-39 kissed the digital tarmac not with a crash, but with a gentle, controlled screech of tortured metal. A shower of sparks erupted on the screen as the multi-million-dollar fighter slid down the center line of the runway, perfectly straight, shedding energy in a long, controlled skid. It slid for what seemed like an eternity before finally, gracefully, coming to a complete stop, engulfed in simulated fire-retardant foam. The simulation ended. The screen went black, replaced by a single, stark white line of text. Aircraft secure. Pilot survived. A collective, shuddering breath was released by everyone in the room. It was as if they had all been holding it for the entire duration of the impossible landing. Then there was nothing. No cheers, no applause, just a profound, echoing silence. It was the silence of shock, the silence of awe, the silence of minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Major Cade Thorne was pale, his jaw slack. He stared at the screen, then at the woman at the console, then back at the screen. The words "pilot survived" seemed to mock him, to indict him. He had designed the scenario to be unwinnable, a crucible to break the spirit of a young pilot. He had never, in his wildest imagination, conceived that someone could not only survive it, but master it with such contemptuous ease. He uttered the only words he could summon, a weak, strangled whisper that was barely audible in the tomb-like quiet. No way. That's not possible, but it was possible. It had just happened. And the architect of that impossibility was now calmly powering down the instructor's console, her work completed. She had not performed for them. She had not acted out of anger or a desire to prove him wrong. She had simply seen a problem, a failing pilot and a crashing plane, and she had solved it with a quiet, devastating competence that was as natural to her as breathing. Her actions were the most complete and crushing refutation of his insults, made all the more powerful because they were delivered without a single word of retort. The demonstration was over. The lesson, however, was just beginning. Into that cavern of stunned silence, a new sound emerged. The slow, deliberate tread of heavy footsteps on the metal gantry of the observation deck. All eyes turned upwards as General Marcus Vance descended the stairs, his face grim and unreadable, like a thundercloud rolling in over a calm sea. He didn't look at the crowd of young pilots or at the shell-shocked Major Thorne. His eyes were fixed on one person, Evelyn Morgan. He walked onto the main floor, his presence sucking the remaining air out of the room. Vance was a man who carried his authority not in his voice, but in his bearing. A former test pilot himself, a veteran of 3 wars, he was a living legend whose respect was the highest currency on the base. He stopped directly in front of the secondary console where Evelyn stood. She turned to face him, her expression as calm and unruffled as it had been before the simulation began. For a long moment, the two of them simply looked at each other, a silent exchange passing between them that no one else in the room could comprehend. It was a look of mutual recognition, of shared understanding forged in crucibles of pressure and secrecy that these younger men could only dream of. The general then turned his gaze to Major Thorne, and the temperature in the room dropped by 20 degrees. "Major," Vance's voice was low, but it had the cutting power of tempered steel. "You said that landing was not possible. You are correct. It is not possible for any pilot currently on the roster for the F-39 program. It is not possible for you. It is not possible for me." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "It is, however, entirely possible for the person who wrote the book on it." He turned back to Evelyn. "Literally, she wrote the Emergency Flight Procedures Manual for the F-39's dead stick, no gear profile. She invented the technique you just witnessed after the first prototype nearly augured in during testing 5 years ago." A wave of murmurs and gasps swept through the junior pilots. They looked at the unassuming woman in the gray jacket, as if seeing her for the first time. The quiet contractor, the butt of their jokes, was not just a technician. She was a creator, a pioneer. General Vance wasn't finished. He strode to the main command console, the one Thorne had guarded so jealously. With a few swift, authoritative keystrokes, he bypassed the standard security protocols. "Computer, access service record for Morgan, Evelyn. Authorization Vance. Marcus, Gamma. 7 clearance." A synthesized voice responded. "Authorization confirmed." Accessing sealed records, a personnel file flashed onto the main screen, the one that had just shown the miraculous landing. The top of the file was stamped with bold, red letters. "Classified. Eyes only. Project Aurora." The room fell silent again, a new kind of awe dawning on them. The name on the file was not Evelyn Morgan. That was her civilian designation. The name listed was Colonel Evelyn Eve Morgan, and below it, the credentials began to scroll, a litany of impossible achievements that struck the onlookers like physical blows. Unit 412th Test Wing, Skunk Works Division, Flight Hours, 8,000 plus, 5,000 plus in experimental and prototype aircraft combat sorties. 128 classified operations, medals, Distinguished Flying Cross with Valor, Legion of Merit, Air Medal with 8 oak leaf clusters. The list went on and on. A secret history of heroism and unparalleled skill. She had flown everything. The YF-23, the bird of prey, secret reconnaissance platforms whose very existence was still denied. She was a ghost, a legend, one of the elite few who flew the machines of tomorrow, today. She wasn't a relic from a past generation. She was a pioneer from the future, living quietly among them. The final line on the screen was the most damning of all. Current assignment, Lead Test Pilot and Chief Technical Advisor, F-39 Wraith Program. Major Thorne looked as if he'd been punched in the gut. The woman he had ordered around, the woman he had publicly mocked and told to go fire up an old Warthog, was not only a pilot, she was a colonel. She was not only a pilot, she was the chief test pilot for the very program he was merely a training administrator for. He had not just been rude to a civilian. He had shown profound disrespect to a superior officer and a giant of aviation. He had committed an act of career suicide, and he had done it in front of his entire command and a 4-star general. The validation was complete, delivered not with a shout, but with the cold, hard, undeniable text on a screen. General Vance let the information hang in the air, a silent, damning indictment of every assumption that had been made in that room. He turned away from his screen and faced Colonel Morgan. In a single, fluid motion that belied his age, he snapped to the position of attention. His back was ramrod straight. His hand came up in a salute so sharp, so precise it could have cut glass. It was not the casual salute one gives colleague. It was a gesture of profound, almost reverent respect, the kind a warrior gives to a revered leader, a king. "Ma'am," he said, his voice ringing with an authority that was absolute. "It is an honor to have you at this facility. I apologize for the unprofessional reception you have received." The word "ma'am" hit the room like a thunderclap. The sight of a 4-star general saluting and formally addressing this quiet woman shattered the last remnants of the young pilot's worldview. Their universe had been turned upside down. The social hierarchy they understood, based on rank, swagger, and a pilot's wings, had been exposed as a fragile illusion. They were in the presence of a different kind of hierarchy, one based on a currency they were only just beginning to comprehend, a legacy of quiet, demonstrated competence. Evelyn Morgan returned the salute with a simple, clean gesture. "Thank you, General." No apology necessary. Her voice was still calm, betraying no hint of triumph or vindication. She had not sought this reveal. She did not require the validation. Her worth was not derived from their opinion of her, but from the skills she had spent a lifetime perfecting in silence and shadow. Her response was the final, perfect expression of the quiet professional. Her work spoke for itself, and it needed no amplification. The general held his salute for a moment longer before crisply dropping his hand. He then turned his full, undivided attention to Major Thorne. Thorne was frozen, a statue of humiliation. His face, once flushed with arrogant pride, was now ashen. He looked like a man who had just watched his own obituary scroll past on the screen. Major Thorne, the general's voice was dangerously soft now, a quiet rumble that promised a storm. "You're the officer in charge of training for this platform. You are responsible for instilling the core values of the Air Force in these young lieutenants. Values like integrity, service before self, and excellence in all we do." He took a step closer to the major, his eyes boring into him. "Today, you have failed on all counts. You replaced integrity with arrogance. You place your own ego before the service of mentoring these officers. And you have demonstrated that you cannot recognize excellence even when it is standing directly in front of you, saving your program from a catastrophic failure you designed to be insurmountable." He gestured back towards Colonel Morgan. "You looked at this officer, and you did not see one of the finest aviators this nation has ever produced. You did not see a warrior who has flown in places you've only seen on satellite maps. You did not see the person singularly most qualified to be in this room. You saw a woman. You saw a civilian contractor. You saw her age. You made assumptions based on the most superficial, the most ignorant, the most unprofessional criteria imaginable. The general's voice rose, not in volume, but in intensity, each word a hammer blow. You told her that this was a young person's game. You were wrong. This is a professional's game. And you, Major, have a great deal to learn about what it means to be a professional. You will personally draft a formal letter of apology to Colonel Morgan. You will then report to my office at 0600 tomorrow morning to discuss your future, which, I assure you, is now profoundly uncertain. Are my instructions clear? Yes. Yes, General. Thorne stammered, his voice barely a whisper. He could not meet the general's eyes. He could not meet anyone's eyes. He could only stare at the floor, the polished concrete reflecting the ruins of his pride. The lesson had been delivered. The hierarchy had been restored. Respect, the general's very posture seemed to say, is not a function of the patches on your shoulder or the volume of your voice. It is earned in silence, in action, in the relentless pursuit of competence. It is earned by being the person who can land the plane when everyone else is falling from the sky. The story of what happened in the F-39 simulator bay did not stay within its sterile walls. It spread, as such stories always do in the closed ecosystem of a military base, with the speed and intensity of a wildfire. It started as whispers in the maintenance hangars, then became hushed conversations over lunch in the mess hall, and finally, it transformed into a full-blown legend, recounted with increasing embellishment in the smoky air of the officers' club. The details shifted with each telling, but the core elements remained the same. The arrogant major, the quiet woman, the impossible simulation, and the stunning reveal. The event was given a name. It became known as the Morgan Landing. The phrase quickly entered the base lexicon. To pull a Morgan meant to display an overwhelming level of competence that silenced all doubters. A difficult exam was a Morgan-level test. A junior officer who showed unusual poise under pressure was said to have a little Morgan in them. The story became a modern fable, a teaching tool passed from seasoned sergeants to fresh-faced airmen. It was a powerful, living reminder that appearances are deceptive and that true expertise is often quiet. The tale was a necessary corrective to a culture that could sometimes prize swagger over substance. It was a story about the virtue of humility and the danger of assumptions. The ripple effect of that single afternoon was profound and lasting. For the young pilots who had witnessed it firsthand, the experience was transformative. Their quiet laughter had turned to stunned silence, and that silence had blossomed into a deep and abiding respect. They saw Colonel Morgan not as an outsider, but as an ideal to which they could aspire. They sought her out, not with the casual disrespect of before, but with a genuine, almost reverent desire to learn. They asked her questions about flight theory, about handling characteristics, about how to maintain calm when every instinct screamed panic. They no longer saw a quiet, older woman. They saw a living library of aviation knowledge, a master of their chosen craft who had nothing to prove to anyone. They began to understand that the path to becoming a true professional was paved not with arrogance, but with a quiet, disciplined, and relentless pursuit of excellence. The most significant transformation, however, was in Major Cade Thorne. The public humiliation he endured could have broken him, could have turned his arrogance into a bitter, simmering resentment. But it did not. The shock of the event was so profound, so complete, that it shattered his ego and forced him to rebuild his entire professional identity from the ground up. He followed the general's orders to the letter. His formal apology to Colonel Morgan was not a perfunctory exercise in box-checking. He sought her out in her temporary office, stood before her at attention, and delivered a heartfelt, sincere, and deeply humbling mea culpa. He apologized not just for his words, but for the attitude behind them, for his failure of leadership, and for the disrespect he had shown to her, her rank, and her incredible legacy of service. He admitted he had been wrong, completely and utterly, and that the lesson she had taught him, without saying a word, was the most important of his career. He had learned that day that he was not the gatekeeper of excellence. He was merely a student, and a novice one at that. His journey was just beginning. Colonel Morgan accepted Major Thorne's apology with a simple, gracious nod. "We all have our blind spots, Major," she said, her voice devoid of any condescension. "The important thing is to learn from them. Now, let's talk about how we can improve the training module to better prepare your pilots for a cascade failure." In that single, simple act of grace, she offered him not just forgiveness, but a path to redemption. She did not hold his ignorance against him. Instead, she enrolled him in her philosophy of quiet competence, turning a moment of humiliation into a teachable opportunity. Thorne, humbled and grateful, became her most dedicated student. He redesigned the entire training syllabus for the F-39 program, with Colonel Morgan's direct input. The unwinnable scenario he had created was refined and renamed the Morgan Landing Drill. It became the capstone exercise for every new Wraith pilot, a brutal but essential test of their ability to remain calm and methodical under extreme duress. It was no longer a tool to break spirits, but a crucible to forge them into true professionals. The story, and the lesson it contained, was immortalized. A junior officer, one of the pilots who had been in the room that day, had the presence of mind to save the raw data from the simulation. The telemetry, a complex stream of numbers and code, was a digital fingerprint of Colonel Morgan's perfect flight. It was printed out a long, cascading scroll of data and framed. It was hung on the wall of the main briefing room, right next to the portraits of the wing's combat heroes. Underneath the unintelligible data, a simple brass plaque was affixed. It read, "The Morgan Landing. In this room, a lesson was learned. The sky does not respect opinion. It only respects skill." The framed data became a touchstone, a symbolic artifact. Veteran pilots would bring new trainees to stand before it, and they would tell the story. They would point to the lines of code and explain how each one represented a moment of perfect calm, a precise input, a decision made in a fraction of a second that meant the difference between life and death. They taught the new generation that the goal was not to be the loudest voice in the room, but to be the one who could fly the code on that wall. The legend of the quiet professional who had humbled the arrogant major became part of the institutional fabric of the base, a permanent and powerful piece of its culture. Colonel Morgan herself, of course, deflected any and all praise. When younger pilots would approach her with awe, she would gently steer the conversation back to technical specifics, to the physics of flight, to the discipline of study and practice. She taught them that mastery was not a destination you arrived at, but a continuous process, a daily commitment to being better than you were the day before. Her humility was the final, and perhaps most important, part of the lesson. It showed them that true confidence requires no external validation. It is quiet. It is internal. It is proven not with words, but with action. It is the calm assurance of knowing that when the engines fail and the sky is falling, you are the one who knows how to land the plane. A year passed. The seasons changed over the high desert landscape of the airbase, but the change within its culture was more permanent. The story of the Morgan Landing was now institutional folklore, a foundational myth told to every new officer who arrived to train on the F-39 Wraith. It was the first story they heard, a parable meant to inoculate them against the virus of arrogance and to instill in them a deep respect for the quiet, often unseen, pillars of competence upon which the entire institution rested. The briefing room itself had become a kind of sanctuary. The framed telemetry data was no longer just a curiosity. It was an object of reverence. Pilots would often stand before it in the quiet moments before a difficult training sortie, drawing a measure of calm and inspiration from the silent testament to perfection hanging on the wall. The name Morgan had become synonymous with a new standard of excellence, one defined not by aggressive swagger, but by calm precision and profound humility. The changes went beyond mere stories. The training doctrine itself had been fundamentally altered. Major Cade Thorne, under the continued mentorship of Colonel Morgan and with the full backing of General Vance, had become a true leader. He was a changed man, quieter, more thoughtful, and infinitely more effective as an instructor. He had learned the hard way that a teacher's job is to build up, not to tear down. He had redesigned the entire training philosophy around the central principle of quiet competence. He taught his pilots that the most important instrument in the cockpit was not the radar or the weapon system, but the pilot's own regulated mind. He used the telemetry from Colonel Morgan's simulation as his primary teaching tool, breaking down every input, every decision, to show the intricate, second-by-second anatomy of masterful airmanship. The F-39 program, once just a crucible for raw talent, became a forge for character. The pilots who graduated were not only supremely skilled aviators. They were humble, disciplined professionals who understood the difference between confidence and arrogance. They carried the story of Evelyn Morgan with them to their new squadrons, and the legend continued to spread, a quiet but powerful current of change flowing through the wider Air Force. Colonel Morgan herself eventually moved on, her work on the F-39 simulator complete. She disappeared back into the classified world from which she had emerged, her name once again becoming a whisper in secure facilities and black projects. She left behind no statues, no portraits, only the enduring legacy of her actions and the powerful lesson they imparted. She hadn't sought to become a legend, but her quiet demonstration of skill had made her one. She had proven, in one unforgettable afternoon, that true strength isn't loud, it's effective. True authority isn't claimed, it's demonstrated. True respect isn't demanded, it is earned through the silent, undeniable language of competence. Her legacy wasn't a memory of a single event. It was a living, breathing change in the way hundreds of future aviators would approach their craft, their careers, and themselves. The final, philosophical truth of that day settled deep into the bedrock of the base's identity. It was a lesson that transcended the world of aviation, speaking to a more universal human principle. It was a story about the profound power of substance over style, of depth over surface. In a world that grows ever louder, that increasingly rewards the most confident voice over the most competent hand, the story of Colonel Morgan became a powerful counter-narrative. It championed the idea that what you are is infinitely more important than what you appear to be. It suggested that the measure of a person is not found in the volume of their claims, but in the quality of their work when the pressure is on. True legacy, the story taught, is not a monument you build to yourself. It is not a collection of awards or a list of titles. True legacy is the knowledge and character that continues to move forward in the people you have influenced. Colonel Morgan's legacy wasn't the framed data on a wall. It was the calm hand of a young pilot guiding his own damaged aircraft to safety years later, remembering the story of a woman who flew a machine that was not supposed to fly. It was the wisdom of a future general, remembering the day his own four-star mentor saluted a quiet contractor and taught him the true meaning of respect. It was the humility of 1,000 officers who learned to judge their peers not by the patches on their uniforms or the swagger in their step, but by the quiet dedication they brought to their duties each and every day. The silence of Evelyn Morgan had been louder than all of Major Thorne's boasts. Her competence was an unshakable truth in a room full of shifting opinions. Her professionalism was a lighthouse in a storm of ego. That is the enduring power of the quiet professional. They do not need to announce their arrival. Their impact, when it comes, is simply undeniable, reshaping the landscape around them not with noise, but with the quiet, irresistible force of proven excellence. They remind us that in the final analysis, when the systems are failing and the ground is rushing up to meet you, assumptions are worthless. Arrogance is a liability. The only thing that matters, the only thing that will ever truly matter, is the quiet,